people. Hello, young people. I think it is incredibly cool that you're here, getting pretty late in the evening to listen to an old professor guy give a lecture. I'm going to do my best to keep you awake. If you're going to fall asleep, do it like with your eyes open. Okay, so this is a talk where in just like 40 minutes or so, I'm going to try to sum up everything I've been doing for the last 40 years of my life, which is figuring out what Zionism is. I mean, it's a word that people use all the time, and sometimes they use it very positively. I'm proud to be a Zionist. It's great to be a Zionist. And then it's a word that, particularly when you get to universities, people will often associate it with something negative, like a Zionist. They associate it with being a racist or with being somebody who's excluding other people. I mean, the word really is quite controversial. So what is it? I mean, my own definition of Zionism, and sorry, I have to turn around for a second. It's a belief that Jews have a right to determine their own fate within the biblical Jewish homeland. And in our tradition, we call that the land of Israel, or Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Long before there was a state of Israel, there was only been a state of Israel since 1948. There has been, even before the biblical kingdoms, thousands of years ago, there was something called the land of Israel. And that's what we call it in our tradition. In much of the world, it's called Palestine. And to call it Palestine is not a political statement. It's not delegitimizing Israel. It's just that part of the world has been called Palestine for thousands and thousands of years. And there's nothing wrong with saying it. I just say this because sometimes I have students who went to Jewish day schools and I say Palestine, and they get all upset. I said, no, I'm not delegitimizing Israel or anything. It's just part of the world and people call it that. But in our tradition, we call it the land of Israel. Okay. And, more than 100 years ago, Jews from around the world formed a Zionist Congress and a movement to create a Jewish homeland. And they even said, what is Zionism? Well, the goal is to create a publicly and legally assured home. Now, there's one word missing from all of these definitions, you might notice. The word is state. That Zionism actually early on was not at all unified about what that home should be. Maybe it'll be under the authority of some European country, or maybe it'll be part of what at that time was the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire that ruled the Middle East. People really weren't sure. And it's pretty funny because a famous Zionist wrote a book called The Jewish State. Theodor Herzl wrote a book called The Jewish State back at the end of the 1800s. And in the book, he writes, it might be a state, it might be something else. So the idea that, we, the Jewish people, need a state is something that came later, actually, during the Second World War and the Holocaust. Now, there was a great Israeli author who died a couple of years ago named Amos Oz, one of the greatest writers in the Hebrew language who ever lived. And those of you who you're getting old enough to read, really serious literature, Oz is fantastic. And he had a great line where he said, Zionism is a family name. And my last name is Penslar. Okay, so that's me. I have a wife. I've got a daughter and a son and 4 grandkids and, parents or whatever. And we all have the same last name, Penslar. But there's a Derek Penslar and a Robin Penslar and a Talia Penslar and so on and so forth. And we're all different people, right? We all have certain common characteristics. Most of us have really lousy vision. But, and we're all Jews. And yet, we're different. And I think what Amos Oz is saying here in this quote, that, I've got cousins and nephews and nieces whom I loathe and whom I'm ashamed, but basically we're all one family. And I think that's really the best way to understand Zionism. It's a way of thinking about what it means to be a Jew in the modern world, but there's lots of different ways of being a Zionist. There is no one definition of Zionism that, encompasses everything. And in fact, some people who 100 years ago were called Zionists, today we might call them non-Zionists, or even anti-Zionists, because the meaning of the term just keeps on changing. And every form of Zionism can be kind of dovish in terms of getting along with the Arabs of the land of Israel, or it can be more hawkish and more aggressive. I mean, it really varies. So there's lots of different kinds of Zionism, and we'll talk about them today. Okay, so I got 7 types of Zionism. Okay, now some of these are going to sound really unfamiliar to you, especially to the adults here, because what I'm going to tell you is not what you heard before, because I decided that the ways we have divided Zionism, the way you were taught when you were younger and all that, actually aren't right, and they have to be rethought. So I've come up with a new scheme, and I think it's more useful, because one way of being a Zionist, and I think this can really matter a lot, especially for young people, let's say you haven't been to Israel, and I know now more and more young people go to Israel because you have bat mitzvah trips, bar mitzvah trips, you have gap year programs. How many people here have been to Israel? So you've almost all of you have been. I mean, this is very, very recent, by the way. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, this wouldn't have been the case. But now airfares are cheap and there's lots and lots of programs and you can go to Israel. But so you've got a connection, you've been to Israel. And some of you may move to Israel. Some of you may. Most of you probably won't. You may spend a lot of time in Israel. You may not. You may go to Israel many times as a visitor. You just don't know. But one thing Zionism will do for Jews, even if they don't live in Israel, it gives them a sense of pride in being Jewish. That's what I call ethnic Zionism. And this is true all over the world and for the last 100 years. I have here a picture of Zionists in Iraq 100 years ago. Why? What did it mean to be a Zionist in Iraq 100 years ago? Were they planning to move to the land of Israel? No, they weren't. But they called themselves Zionists. What did it mean? They were proud to be Jewish. They had a sense of being part of the Jewish nation, and they were proud of what was happening in Palestine. They were proud that Jews were building a homeland there. They didn't want to live there, but they were proud of it. So it's a kind of a sense of ethnic identity. And that's something a lot of us carry with us when we say we're Zionists. Not everyone. Some of you might wind up living in the state of Israel, but a lot of us are more ethnic. And that kind of ethnic Zionism can be very long distance. So this is a button that there's some people in the room who are my age. In the 1970s, lots of people were wearing these buttons that said, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel must live. And because in the 70s, Israel was going through a tough time like it's going through now. And it was a kind of long distance ethnic Zionism. One very important way, by the way, that Zionism is expressed by Jews outside of Israel in an ethnic way is food. Now, tonight's dinner, which was delicious, was not exactly Israeli cuisine. Pasta, meatballs, sauce. I think it might be another country that starts with I. But the fact is that a lot of Jews throughout the world today, they get together and they eat hummus and falafel, and it's a way of kind of exploring their connection to Israel by eating Israeli food. I have no idea, by the way, if the food at Shomrei Torah was any good, but so ethnic Zionism then is just a way of feeling Jewish. Now, there's another kind of Zionism, the second kind. Now I'm going to talk mainly to the grown-ups because you, the young people, no one's going to hit you up tonight for a contribution for the state of Israel. But you, the grown-ups, you've probably gotten hit up a lot in your lives to give money for the state of Israel. It just reminds me, I was invited to like a fundraiser, or not a fundraiser. I thought it was just going to be an evening in honor of a certain Jewish leader in Boston. And I went and then I realized, oh my God, I'm in a fundraiser. And I thought this is going to be the most expensive salmon I ever ate in my life. And sure enough, the master of ceremonies goes from table to table and says, basically, you're not leaving this room until you make a pledge. And it's got to be at least 180 and, or more. Okay, fine. So the fact is that there's a very strong Jewish tradition of giving money to help the poor. It's called tzedakah. And even young people, you're taught very young to have the tzedakah box and to, put the money into the box. And there's been a long tradition in Zionism going back to the really end of the 1800s of giving money to buy land in the land of Israel or plant trees or whatever. So Zionism is often expressed in terms of philanthropy, which is really like charity, except it's a bit more scientific and a bit more goal-directed. And some of the most famous Zionists, most famous Jews in 20th century America, some of them will be names you've heard of, some of them are names you haven't. They really were Zionists in the sense that their job was to raise money to help build up what would become the state of Israel. Some of them were bankers like Louis Marshall, the banker, Felix Warburg, the American Supreme Court Judge Louis Brandeis, after whom I've heard there's a university somewhere here in Boston that was named after him. There you go. Okay, Brandeis alum or faculty. And the Women's Zionist Organization of America, Hadassah, which actually was the core of Zionism in America in the 20s and 30s, was women in this organization called Hadassah. And they raised money and they gave money for things like hospitals and schools in the land of Israel. So to be a Zionist really meant, I think there's a joke that to be a Zionist is to raise money to give to another person who will give it to another person who moves to the land of Israel. Right. So raising money is actually a very serious component of being a Zionist. Back in the 1920s and 30s and all the way, in some ways up to the present, even if we don't live in Israel, there's a strong sense of admiration for the country. And one way that Jews in diaspora express that is through giving money. I just have here, I wrote a book about emotions and Zionism, and one thing I looked at was all the fundraising literature that American Jews produced in 1948 when Israel was fighting its war for independence, and the sense of frenzy, very much like what we're going through now, where Jews are giving money and they're trying to really mobilize support for the country. It's a very strong feeling with a lot of guilt laid on as well. So I want to play you a few minutes from a fundraising film that I managed to dig up in the U.S. Holocaust Museum archives about why Zionism sometimes is just about guilt, especially maybe not so much now, but in the 40s and 50s, it was basically, you American Jews, you survived the war in comfort, where the Jews in Europe, many of them, a great many of them, 2/3 of them were slaughtered, and you need to give money for the ones who have survived. So let me just play a few minutes.
Too well what waiting, the cold chills in hospital care is woefully inadequate.
These are Jews from Eastern Europe who have survived the Holocaust, and they've been in refugee camps in Europe, and now they've come to Israel, but they're just living in refugee tent cities because there's nowhere for them to live right now. They don't have housing yet. So
in the camp at Pardes Hanna, there are only 50 hospital beds for 11,000 people. What happens to those who are stricken? Only a small number can be accommodated in the hospital. The rest have to lie in their tents. The sun bakes them during the day. The cold chills them at night. This woman has little chance to recover. The camp authorities are fighting a desperate battle to prevent disaster. Clinics have been set up, but the sick must wait hours to see a doctor. You can't explain to a sick child why this must be. The adults know only too well what waiting means. They've been waiting for long, almost unending years. But the children, the 11,000 children in the camps, can't understand. This baby never heard of the United Jewish Appeal, of unfilled quotas, unpaid pledges. All she knows is the pain that is always with her. The nurses, the doctors do their best, but they're... We must act now, today. Cash is the only thing that'll get them out of these camps. Cash is the only thing that will give them a new home. Cash for the United Jewish Appeal will fulfill our promise that they shall not be homeless again.
So it's not super subtle, but it worked. It worked. American Jews gave $150 million, which was the equivalent of $1.5 billion today in 1948. So, a kind of Zionism based on philanthropy is serious stuff. It's a way of expressing, money it can be a way of expressing strong feelings of attachment. And it's continuing on, even during this 1967 war, 73 war, all the way up to the present. I mean, this is one way that Jews in diaspora express their support for Israel, is through giving money. Okay, the third kind of Zionism might be a little more familiar. It's what's called political Zionism, which means how are you going to create a home for the Jews? How are you going to create a safe home for them? So you had one of the founders, the guy with the beard, Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of the Zionist organization and traveled the world trying to get support for a Jewish homeland. He was succeeded by Chaim Weizmann, who in World War I was able to get a promise or a statement from the British government that they would help support a Jewish national home. And then in the lower left, David Ben-Gurion, who became effectively the political leader of the Jewish community in Palestine when it was under British rule in the 20s through 40s. And then he became the first prime minister of the state of Israel. And then the last guy, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was also a very important interwar political leader. And what they all really worked hard together was to work with the British government and the international community, various countries of the world, to get support for what would become a Jewish homeland. And again, as I said earlier, it wasn't necessarily about a state. although during World War II, as things got worse and worse for the Jews, the Zionist organization proclaimed we must have a state in Palestine to accommodate the Jewish people. One thing that political Zionism really borrowed on or gained strength from was the fear that a great catastrophe would befall the Jews. And already in the 1920s, a lot of early Zionists had beards. I guess a lot of Jews had beards. Anyway, Max Nordau, a famous physician and writer, essentially wrote in the early 20s that the Jews of East Europe are going to get slaughtered someday, and we really need a homeland for them in the land of Israel to protect them. And that fear of catastrophe has remained very powerful in Israel and throughout the Jewish world as a source of Zionism. So the prime minister of Israel in the early 80s, Menachem Begin, had a long, long history of deep, deep worry that the Jews of the world were in grave danger. His own family was wiped out in the Holocaust in Poland. And it's interesting how in recent years that fear of catastrophe that has fed Zionism has continued, but it's been less that Jews in the diaspora are endangered and more that Israel itself might be destroyed. So here we see the ever-present prime minister of Israel, who's been prime minister longer than anyone else, Benjamin Netanyahu, in 2012, talking about how Iran is developing a nuclear bomb and how that would be catastrophic for Israel. And again, that's a way of mobilizing Jewish support throughout the world for Israel, is the fact that either diaspora Jews are in danger or Jews in Israel are in danger, or both. And that feeling of danger has grown immeasurably just in the last 2 months when, on October 7th, Hamas guerrillas killed at least 1,200 Israelis in a very cruel and barbaric, in a barbaric manner. So we're in a funny world right now where on the one hand, diaspora Jews worry for their own safety and their own future, but they also worry about Israel. And and this whole question of where are Jews safe is very uncertain, but it certainly feeds support for Israel. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that a lot of Israelis have been saying, gee, well, maybe right now you're safer as a Jew living in Boston than living in Jerusalem, because Israel is supposed to be the place where Jews will be safe. But a lot of Israelis' faith in the country has been shaken. But still, in general, we're funny people, we Jews. The more we worry, the more we act. And the more we worry, often the more we support the state of Israel. Now I want to talk about the kind of Zionism I like best. It's called transformative Zionism. This was a super popular form of Zionism really from the 19-teens and 20s until just maybe 10, 20 years ago. And this was the kind of Zionism that the idea of Zionism is not just to create a safe place for Jews. It's not just to create a place where Jews will be, comfortable. It's to create a place where Jews can become something new, where they can build a better society, a just society, a socially virtuous society, and that Jews themselves will change. There was a lot of romanticism in the early 1900s and really up until late in the 1900s that to be an Israeli would mean to actually change physically, get a suntan. There's a lot of diaspora Jews write about how wonderful it is. They go to Israel, everyone's tanned, and they talk about how beautiful the women are and how muscular and how bronzed the men are. And this idea of creating a kind of a new Jew, Ivri Hadash, or Ha-Ivri HaChadash, the new Hebrew. This was a really powerful form of Zionism and admiration for Jews. Here we see Jewish bodybuilders. So here we have Jewish gymnasts in Turkey and in Germany. And how do they express their Zionism? They do bodybuilding. We're going to literally improve the Jewish body. And a lot of that idea of Zionism was also about not just improving your body, but improving your soul. So here we have one of the great socialist Zionist leaders of the 1930s and 40s, Meir Ya'ari. He was the founder of one of the movements that established collective farms in Israel, known as kibbutzim. And a lot of the ideal of the collective farm was not just that you would be a farmer and you would work, but that you would be an honest, authentic individual. So it's very much an idea about morality and about transformation on an individual level. The idealization of labor. Here we see, young Jews working in the orchards. I had my experience. I'm of that age where the way that you became a Zionist was by moving to Israel and living on one of these collective farms. where I spent a year, picking bananas and picking grapefruit and working in the factories and getting all muscular or whatever. And, feeling like I even changed my name. I didn't like the name Derek, because you know what Derek is when people in Israel try to say Derek? Drek. Ask your parents what Drek means in Yiddish. Drek, hey, Drek. I remember the labor. Yeah. You're right. You got it. Yeah. Yep. You win. Drek. So I remember the labor, the guy, the foreman, the Satran Avodah would say, Drek, bananot, Drek, Beit Charoshe, Drek. So I thought, screw this. So my middle name is Jonathan. So I thought, Yonatan. I'll go by the name of Yonatan. Nice Israeli name. And I went by Yonatan for years until people in Israel would say, you have a brother named Derek or whatever. So anyway, so the idea of changing yourself, here we see a Jewish youth group in Warsaw, and what are they doing? They're running in their t-shirts in the cold so they can strengthen themselves and get ready for life in the land of Israel. It could also have a kind of militant end to it. So here we see a right-wing youth group in Poland, Zionist youth group called Beitar. And here they are marching, wearing military-style uniforms, the men and the women carrying flags. But it's all tied up with ideas of strength, pride, and really transforming yourselves. And definitely being a fighter. The idea of the Jew as someone who will fight and, if need be, die for their country. The Jewish fighter, often coded as male, but as you can see from this slightly suggestive photograph, also the woman with her short shorts and holding the rifle. Again, there's a kind of classic 20th century idea that when you have a liberation movement, the women fight as well as the men. In Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, back in the 1960s, they called the women fighters long-haired warriors. This is actually a very common idea in the history of liberation. So the transformative Zionism was really intoxicating. The idea of becoming a new kind of person, building a new kind of state, a folk dancing in a sense of community. One of my favorite lines in Hebrew poetry from the poet Natan Alterman, how thin is the line, how thin is the line between the verge of catastrophe and the eve of jubilation, that the Jews will work together, sacrificing themselves as need be to create a new homeland. Orthodox Jews were affected by this kind of transformative value too. There were collective farms established by Orthodox Jews as well as secular Jews. They also had this idea of improving their body. And a kind of folk hero who embodied many of the ideals of what I would say political, catastrophic, transformational Zionism. One of the great heroes of Israeli history was the military commander Moshe Dayan. He was the chief of staff in the early 50s. He was the secretary or the minister of defense during the 1967 war. He was good looking, he was charismatic, he was from an agricultural settlement, he spoke the most beautiful Hebrew you can imagine, and he was kind of a symbol of the new Hebrew male. So when does transformational Zionism end? I think it really ended at the end of the last century. Now, you go to Israel, I think what a lot of young people do now is they go to Tel Aviv and they work for a startup, because Israel has become a global center for high technology. It's really quite remarkable what Israel does. But there aren't that many young people now who want to go to Israel and work on a farm and get bronze. Well, they might want to hang out at the beach, but it's not quite the same thing as the kind of, getting up at 4 a.m, as I had to do, and do, really extremely taxing agricultural labor. So really transformational Zionism, I think, has largely came to an end. The fifth kind of Zionism I want to talk about is what I call cultural Zionism, which is something that's a little harder to understand maybe for diaspora Jews or Jews in North America. In Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, until really the middle of the 20th century, language and literature were extremely important ways by which people express their identity. So those Jews in Iran or in Iraq or in Egypt or wherever, if they spoke Arabic or Persian, a lot of them were very proud that they saw Hebrew as a language very close to their own native language. A lot of Arabic-speaking Jews said, Hebrew is so like Arabic, and it's a beautiful language, and Hebrew and Arabic should be taught together and studied together. A lot of the founders of modern Hebrew education in the land of Israel were Jews from Aleppo and from Damascus, or Jerusalemite Jews who'd been in the area for many, many generations. They were Jews whose native language was Arabic. And then there were the Jews in Eastern Europe whose native language was Yiddish, which is kind of related to medieval German. But they knew Hebrew very well as a religious language, and they modernized it. They turned it into a modern language, a language that you could write novels in, that you could have a conversation in. And to them, this was the way you define yourself as a Zionist. And I'm not sure how important it is now, because when I moved to Israel in the early 80s, you couldn't survive if you didn't speak Hebrew. You just could not. You would be completely isolated if you weren't fluent in Hebrew. So I had to learn Hebrew. Now you go to Israel, good luck finding someone who'll speak Hebrew with you. Everybody speaks English, right? It's a classic small country in the 21st century sense of the word, that the English language taking over the planet. So there are still in Israel, mind you, lots and lots of native Israeli Hebrew speakers who love the Hebrew language, and Hebrew is a language that produces hundreds and hundreds of novels every year. And you go to this every year, there's this festival in the late spring called the Jewish Book Week. It's incredible. They take the largest public square in Tel Aviv and open it up. There's books everywhere. It's nerd heaven, okay? I love going there. And so it is a country that's deeply, deeply literate, but there aren't that many Jews outside of Israel who have that kind of love of the Hebrew language that was so common in the 20th century, even my own generation. So that kind of Zionism has faded a bit. And yet Israel is a kind of cultural center for diaspora Jews, not for the Hebrew language so much, but okay, you've mostly been to Israel. How many of you go to Jewish summer camp? Okay, so no, fair number of you. Okay, so Jewish summer camp, there's a lot of Israel in Jewish summer camp, right? And there's a lot of Hebrew words in Jewish summer camp. And so Israel has become a kind of, oh, there's a flag of Israel, right? Isn't that the, okay, so Israel becomes a kind of part of our, even a secular Jewish identity. So even if you're not a Hebrew speaker, Israel still has a kind of deep cultural meaning. Now, I've talked about 5 forms of Zionism, and some of you might be wondering, especially the rabbi, where's religion? Nicha, I'm getting there. What I call sacral or religious Zionism. Well, of course, there's a religious element to Zionism. I mean, Jews have been, the land of Israel is central to the Hebrew Bible. Jews have been praying for millennia for the return to the land of Israel. There have always been Jews living in the land of Israel, often living lives of prayer and study. And for many Jews in the 18 and 1900s, if they wanted to move to the land of Israel, they moved because they would live a full Jewish life there. They could observe all the commandments there. They could basically live a completely authentic religious Jewish life. But there's something more to being an Orthodox Jew and Zionism than just being able to practice Jewish law. And that's the idea that's very controversial among Orthodox Jews. To what extent does a Jew moving to the land of Israel actually help bring about the coming of the Messiah, something which is in our prayer book, that we pray over and over again for, the coming of the Messiah, whether it's, well, in all sorts of prayers, Ba'agalav Yizman Kariv, in speedily and in our days. Well, if you look at the prayer for the state of Israel, which was written by not one, but 2 rabbis, and one of the greatest Hebrew authors of the mid-20th century, you see here that it says, "Our Father in heaven," and so on, "bless the state of Israel, the first manifestation of the approach of our redemption," which is like the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. Reshit simichat gulatenu. It's not marking that the Messiah is going to come tomorrow, but the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. It's like the first rays of dawn towards a new world, of the world of the Messianic era, in which Jews will be free, will not suffer, and will not be hated. And there will be, as it says in the Aleinu prayer, and on that day, all will bend their knee, all will pray to you, and the Lord will be one. So this is a prayer that's recited, I assume, in this synagogue and in many synagogues all over the world. And that kind of Messianic Zionism can have very powerful effects. So for some Jews, not the majority, but for some Jews who have moved to Israel in the last 50, 60 years, and for some Jews from Israel, they believe that Zionism represents the imminent, like soon, coming of the Messiah. And you see this particularly with some of the Jews who have moved into the West Bank, into territories that Jews took in 1967. So here we see a group of religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, in the city of Hebron, which is one of the sacred cities to the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And they're dancing and they're celebrating the Jewish presence in this area. And there's a very strong sense of imminent messianism. And then the last form of Zionism, which is in some way the hardest to talk about, is it's not necessarily a religious Zionism. It's not necessarily about culture. And it's not just pride in being Jewish. It's simply, we are a nation. That's it. We don't have to be better than other people. We don't have to change like transformative Zionism. We're just a nation, and we have a right to be here in the land of Israel, and we really don't owe anything to anyone. And I think the real challenge of Judaic Zionism is that, well, the fact is 25% of the citizens of the state of Israel aren't Jewish. About most of those are Arabs, and then there are all kinds of other people who, I mean, there's a lot of non-Jews who are citizens of the state of Israel, and there's going to be more and more of them in time. They have somewhat higher birth rates than the Jews, although the differences aren't quite as bad as, or as prominent as people think. So, you know, if the state of Israel is a democratic state and supposed to be a state that protects all of its people, then if your Zionism means just, well, we're just Jews and we have rights and we really don't care about social equity, we don't really care that much about democracy, what happens to the non-Jews? So Judaic Zionism can go in different directions. In 2018, for example, the Israeli parliament passed what they call a basic law. These are the fundamental laws of the state of Israel in the place of a constitution, that the realization of self-determination for a nation is limited to Jews in the land of Israel, or the state of Israel. So, you know, what about other people? And then Jewish settlement is a national value. Well, what about the non-Jews in the country? And what about they deserve a place to live too? Because right now in the state of Israel, non-Jews are 25% of the country, but they only have access to 3% of the land. The other 97% of the land is reserved for Jews only. So it's a problem. So I think this kind of Zionism presents challenges that maybe some of the other types of Zionism don't. It can range politically. It can be very far right-wing. So, for example, two ministers in the current Israeli government, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's the Minister of National Security, and Bezalel Smotrich is the Minister of Defense. These are people who have made it very clear that they do not really have the same kind of concerns for the Arab citizens of Israel, or as they do for the Jewish citizens of Israel. They also are very interested in annexing the territories that Israel conquered in 1967, that is in the West Bank. So, but there aren't the same sort of values, I would say, of social equity or of transformation or of cultural change. It's just Jews, as it were, as Jews. And Ben-Gvir and some other Jews were very active in an organization called Lahava, whose purpose is to prevent romantic associations, love affairs and marriages between Jews and non-Jews. So this is the kind of extreme Zionism that this group stands for. But it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, there are forms of what I would call a more Judaic Zionism that are much more benign. And I want to finish with really a very beautiful song. It's a song that was written during the pandemic, so it was recorded on Zoom. And it's a song in which many of the finest singers in the state of Israel sing about how much they love the country. And it's a very beautiful song. I just want to play a little bit of it for you. It's also very popular among youth groups, so you may have heard it. A tribe of brothers and sisters. Oh, it was the same people who wrote Toy. Cool. Okay. Okay. We'll get the song. Come on.
70 שנה במכונית, אני נוסע ומביט על מה היה ומה נהיה, ואיך נפשי עוד הומייה מהמצדה של הסליחות, ירושלים בסליחות, מחוף כנרת ואכסי,
מהמסיבות של תל אביב. אבי חלם והתפלל
לחיות בארץ ישראל. היום ילדי אותי שואל, מה הסיפור של ישראל?
כאן זה בית, כאן זה לב,
ואותך אני לא עוזב.
אבותינו שורשים,
ואנחנו הפרחים המלגינות, שבט אחים ואחיות, אותה שכונה.
Anyway, it's very catchy. Very pretty song. And as I've written here, it's 35 singers, very diverse group, Ashkenazic Jews, that is Jews of European origin, Mizrahi Jews, Jews of Middle Eastern, North African origin, Ethiopian Jews, secular Jews, religious Jews, but they're all Jews. And there is the one woman you saw earlier, the first woman, she's actually is an Arab, but she's a convert to Judaism. And well, what about the 25% of the country that isn't Jewish? So, Eretz Achim V'Achayot, well, what about everybody else? And this is a challenge that the state of Israel is dealing with. And I think the difference between this kind of form of Zionism and a lot of the others is they were more willing to acknowledge this. For someone like Theodor Herzl, founder of political Zionism, he wrote a novel in which one of the main characters was a non-Jew. It was an Arab who is part of the new Jewish society. And, he has his friends in that society. He has his separate identity. And the socialist Zionists, the transformational Zionists also, I can't say they always succeeded, but they did think about this question about what it means to have a Jewish state and what about the fact that it's going to have a lot of non-Jews in it. So this last form of Zionism is in some ways, I find, personally, I do find it a bit more challenging than the other 6. But the point is, we could probably say there's even more. I've given you 7. We could probably go on, but I won't. As Steve Martin once said, the comedian Steve Martin once said at an awards ceremony, he said, I could go on, but so many of the others have. So I'll stop. But I just want to end by saying that at least I've given you a taste that to say you're a Zionist, fine. But and I'm not saying you have to go into this with everybody you talk to about what kind of Zionist you are. But it might be interesting, especially for those of you who, have been to Israel a couple of times and if you care a lot about Israel, to think about what Israel means to you and what Zionism means to you. Because what I really want to emphasize and encourage you all to understand is that Zionism is pluralistic and that you can be Zionistic in more than one way. Especially you get to the university and you get to somewhere like Hillel where Jews, they all call themselves Zionists, but they have such different definitions and concepts of what it means to be a Zionist. It can cause some tensions, but it's okay. First of all, we're Jews, which means we argue and we disagree, but we do it within the family because, as I said, quoting almost, Zionism is it's a family name. Okay, so thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions or whatever comes next.
Thank you very much, Dr. Penslar. Anyone who has a question, please raise your hand. I'll come by with the microphone and you can ask your question.
Thank you for your talk. In your first slide, you commented on the aim of the First Zionist Congress as establishing for Jews a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. It was missing the word exclusively.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that go? I mean, from the original settlers through before World War I.
You mean the idea of somewhere else?
The idea that the home for Jews was exclusively
Oh,
for Jews.
well, that was actually not, as it were, written in stone. That is, in the early 1900s, when Jews were thinking about their own personal safety, there were a lot of conversations, like, where should we go? Where will we be safe? One idea was we should go to the land of Israel because it's the homeland of the Jewish people and religious significance and so on and so forth. But there were a lot of Jews at that time who said that's not a great idea. It belongs to the Ottoman Empire. They won't want us to be there. There are 500,000 Arabs in Palestine. They won't want us to be there. And so there were Jews called territorialists, and they had ideas. Let's establish a Jewish homeland somewhere else. Herzl even flirted with this idea. The British government in 1903 said, why don't you Jews, while you're waiting to see what will happen in Palestine, we've got some nice real estate in East Africa along the Uganda Railway, and we're looking for settlers, and why don't you come? And so it's in what's today Kenya. But the Zionists, for some reason, called it Uganda, but it wasn't. It was Kenya. And Herzl looked into it. He said, maybe we should take advantage of it because it's recognition by the British that we actually are a people and we have a claim. But the Zionists turned it down. And there were attempts here and there in the years following to create some kind of Jewish society in other places. But the fact is that Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was the only one that had the attraction and the appeal. And really what nailed it down completely was after this crisis of the East Africa scheme, the Zionist movement decided, no, not exclusively. They didn't change the Basel program, this program, but they would no longer deal with a possibility outside of the land of Israel. And then during World War I, Chaim Weizmann gets the British to agree that they will help promote a Jewish national home in Palestine. So that idea of a Jewish homeland somewhere else, you still see it here and there. Anybody read the novel called The Yiddish Policeman's Union? Yeah, it's the idea of a Jewish homeland in Alaska or something. I would have been interested in Tierra del Fuego myself. But okay, here we are, the land of Israel. Yes. Oh, do you need the? I think you need the microphone.
We're forcing you to use the mic.
There we go. Sorry about that. I'm too tall for. There we go.
So
I'm only tall in a Jewish setting. Just a second. I'm 6'2". In Holland, I'm like short, but here I'm tall. Okay.
okay. So my question is, today in Israel today, what are teenagers, what are college students? Is Zionism taught? Are they taught to be proud Zionists? In what way? Just like in America, I mean, we're really not taught to be great Americans, and it's certainly proven itself.
Some Americans are doing a really good job not being great Americans. Look, in Israel's a much more patriotic country, I'd say. In the United States, patriotism is often associated more with the right and then with the left. I think in Israel, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish majority of the state of Israel would say that they are patriotic Israelis. When you think about the way that, there was the disaster of October 7th, and the government was completely malfunctioning, and the prime minister wouldn't even authorize the trains to operate to, get soldiers to the front. What happened? Israeli civil society, people, jumped in their cars and they're driving soldiers to the front, and they're providing shachpats, like flak jackets and sleeping bags. And the Israeli civil society is so, there's this kind of sociological term, sticky. They really are cohesive. And it's something to keep in mind, because for the last year before the disaster of October 7th, Israel seemed quite divided over the issue of whether or not they should weaken the power of the court system. And there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets demonstrating every week. And a lot of people thought, oh, the country's on the verge of civil war and everything. But Israel has remarkable cohesion. And I think it really is patriotism. And the educational system is Zionist in the sense that Israeli children are taught about Zionism, and they're taught about the word Zionut, and they're taught about Herzl and about the achievements of the early Zionists. The only real difference between Israeli education now and when my kids went to school in Israel 30 years ago is that now the school system has a lot more emphasis on Orthodox Jews and the role of Orthodox Jews in the early Zionist movement. And, they're finding all kinds of rabbis who wrote a pamphlet or something. And, I think, my opinion, I think some of it is a little exaggerated. But so no, I think and it does really work on the left as well as the right. Just remember that some of the most important leaders of civil society in the last 2 months have been exactly the same people who were leading the protests against the government during the year before that. So there's a question up
We have
front and then in the
somebody
back.
right here first.
Okay. Yeah.
That was a very interesting lecture. Thank you. We're hearing a lot of and seeing a lot of chaos on college campuses right now in the States. And there are a lot of slogans being thrown around.
Yeah.
And given this week's congressional hearing, I'm seeing a lot on college campuses where people are saying that anti-Zionism is or isn't anti-Semitism.
Right.
And I'm interested to hear your view on that.
So I'll try to say it in 5 minutes or 3 minutes. It's okay. Thinking of where to start. If anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, then the Satmar Hasidim are anti-Semites. Now, the Satmar Hasidim, this is the largest of the Hasidic communities in the world, and they do not recognize the validity of the state of Israel. They're not completely anti-Zionist, by the way, and they've been very supportive of the communities in Israel that have been damaged or destroyed in the last, on October 7th. But, the fact is that there are many Jews in the world, particularly in the universities, who, for whatever reasons, even if I don't agree with them, I believe they have a right to their views, who believe that the state of Israel was not the most appropriate solution to the Jews' problems, or they believe that the state of Israel in its current form is not, behaving the way they would like it to. So these people would call themselves non or anti-Zionists. Are these people anti-Semites? How do you define anti-Semitism? If you define anti-Semitism as someone who's an anti-Zionist, well, then that's a tautology. But if you define anti-Semitism in terms of people who hate Jews, people who fear Jews, people who have conspiracy theories about Jews, people who attribute to Jews all kinds of collective powers that they don't have, then it's totally possible to be an anti-Zionist and not be an anti-Semite. So I'm finding a lot of the language now to be very disturbing. There's also the fact that a person can be very angry at Israel and even hateful of Israel, and they may or may not be an anti-Semite. I mean, there are people who hate Israel who are anti-Semites, lots of them. Do they have a right to say these things in a university environment? Well, that's a First Amendment issue. There must be, this is a Jewish audience. How many First Amendment lawyers do we have? If at Harvard there were a demonstration of Ukrainian students and they were shouting, "Free Ukraine, Ukraine from the Dnieper to the whatever," I don't know, and they were shouting, "Death to Russia," and Russian students walking by said, "I feel really uncomfortable." Would Harvard prohibit those protests? I don't think so. Or if Tibetan students said, "Free Tibet," and, "Down with China, the hell with China," Harvard might only shut down the protests because they're afraid of China, throwing all their Harvard researchers into jail or something. But so I don't, again, maybe the First Amendment lawyers can correct me. I don't see how legally a university can stop people from saying these things. And I don't think that anti-Zionism has to be anti-Semitic. I do think a university has an obligation to call out hateful language. There's a very good piece about this, by the way, in an Israeli newspaper a couple of days ago by a colleague of mine at UCLA named Dov Waxman. He says universities should call out hateful language. It's immoral, it's insensitive, it's barbaric, it's just plain wrong. But censoring it causes a lot of problems. I think that's my answer. It doesn't make things easier for Jewish students who, walk through Harvard Yard and they see slogans that say "Free Gaza" or, whatever. But I remember seeing this sort of thing at Berkeley when I was a PhD student. And I remember being a student in Berlin in the late 70s when Israel had briefly invaded Lebanon, and the Palestine issue was becoming really big in Europe in the late 1970s. And there was a lot of support for the Palestinians among German radical youth. So I remember going through the cafeterias and the university, and there were all these pro-Palestinian signs and people wearing keffiyehs. And I remember at the time, I was 19. It's like, okay, what they're doing. I mean, it didn't freak me out. So a lot of what's going on now is that there's this alarming increase, but a lot of it also depends on how we react to it. And then this question of what the university legally is allowed to do and not do, I think is really important. I suspect that President Gay had a lot of lawyers coaching her before her comments, which is one reason why they may have seemed rather canned, but I trust the lawyers in the audience to tell me. There were other questions. There's a question up front.
Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to ask, what do you think about the anti-Zionist Jewish
Jewish anti-Zionists.
Jewish anti-Zionist groups today?
Yeah.
Especially in the light of their joining the pro-Palestinian or maybe pro-Hamas.
Right.
And then where do they are? And basically being a Jew doesn't mean you're a Zionist.
No, that's the thing, is that you can be a Jew, and there are many ways of being a Jew. Let's say you're an Orthodox Jew and you keep all the commandments, and you marry a Jew, right? You keep the Sabbath and everything, but you want nothing to do with Israel, or you dislike Israel. Are you not a Jew? Of course you're a Jew. You're just an anti-Zionist Jew. Okay, so was it 2 weeks ago, there was a one-day occupation of University Hall at Harvard, that's an administration building, by a group of students calling themselves Jews for Palestine. Evidently, 3 or 4 of them were Jewish and the rest were not. But anyway, Jews for Palestine. And they spent the day there, and then they got hungry. And they'd forgotten to bring food. So the university, the oppressive colonial administration of the university gave them burritos and Twizzlers. Because, you know, that's just how horrible they are. And they spent the night comfortably in the basement, and they went home. Okay, the next day. They left behind all kinds of interesting slogans and graffiti scrawled in chalk in front of University Hall. So I walked over to look at their writing, including some very well-written Hebrew graffiti, including, by the way, Nachman of Bratslav. Beautiful, with the nikud and everything. They would get an A for me for their grammar. You know, so fine. So I'm sitting there looking at this stuff, and out of nowhere, I swear to God, appears a Tibetan monk. Out of nowhere, in full regalia. He just looks at me, he comes to me. He's looking at this stuff. He says, "What about our occupation? What about Tibet?" And I said to him, "Yeah, good question. What about it?" And we talked about the occupation of Tibet by China and the Sinicization of Tibet, and he was surprised that I know about it. I tell him I teach courses on comparative conflict. So this is Harvard, right? So we have this whole conversation. And then I say to him, we need to pray for peace. And then he says, "I'm a monk. I pray all the time." It's so Jewish. And off he goes. But what we were talking about is, okay, so there are Jewish students who choose to identify as Jews with certain social values. And they believe that the state of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, they believe that it's privileging of certain rights, or granting of certain rights and freedoms to Jews rather than non-Jews. This violates their social ethics. That's what they believe. So there is a certain kind of Jew that actually defines their Jewishness, ironically, in terms of being an anti-Zionist. And there's a kind of intellectual pedigree. People like Hannah Arendt or I.F. Stone or George Steiner, I mean, really serious Jewish intellectuals. Today, Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin, I mean, these are serious people. Judith Butler, I don't agree with them, but it's what they think. Now, does this mean that we have to then engage with them? Over the years, I've had some contacts with JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace. It's a far anti-Zionist organization. They have some interesting members. I was shocked, though. I mean, I was really shocked when they endorsed the Hamas massacre on October 7th. I thought, what is happening with these people? Well, it's very interesting. Again, I have colleagues at Harvard who are Jewish and who are anti-Zionist out of principle, and they were horrified by what JVP's leadership did. Again, there's 7 varieties of Zionism. There's probably 7 varieties of anti-Zionism. So it is an issue. My own view is if a Jew wants to define themselves as an anti-Zionist, you know, who am I to stop them? It's not common, but I don't know if that answers the question, but what? So the question is then, what would drive a certain kind of anti-Zionist Jew to endorse or to celebrate or more likely to rationalize what Hamas did? And I think this is just a classic far left identification with the oppressed, with the wretched of the earth. And the idea being that if people are occupied and oppressed, they will behave in ways that we find abhorrent, but we have to understand their situation. What's interesting to me is how many of my colleagues at Harvard on the far left refuse to embrace that position. So that's what interests me. So it's, you know, is the anti-Zionist glass half empty or half full? So I'm interested in how many of my colleagues have been horrified by that endorsement.
So thank you very much. I've been really confused by all this the Zionism that you just went through, and I've been trying to gather that all in my head. But so one question that comes to mind: if there are so many different forms, and you dilute each other by having them all living together in Israel,
Right.
has there been a component of, or some components that are dominant that have influenced the evolution of the state?
Yes.
And lead to policies and progress. I think particularly of '67
Yeah.
and the success in that war, and as a consequence, the development of settlements in the
Yeah.
West Bank and so on.
Sure. So the three kinds of Zionism that have been by far the most powerful, influential in the state of Israel have been political Zionism, the genius of people like Herzl, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, the ones who crafted the state of Israel, the ones who crafted its institutions. Okay, political Zionism. Transformational Zionism, which built the farms, the factories, the national economy, the ethos of the state of Israel for many, many years, even if it's now weakened, was incredibly powerful. And then religious or sacral Zionism. Because of all the forms of Zionism, there's really only one today, strongly ideological form of Zionism that's really full of vitality and vibrancy and growth, and that is various forms of sacral or religious Zionism. That's what fuels the more ideological settlement drive in the West Bank. That's what motivates, I mean, really the state of Israel has become increasingly religious in recent years. And so I think, yeah, religious Zionism is a very dynamic ideology. So I think those are the types that have had the greatest impact. Yeah.
Thank you again for a great lecture. One clarification, which I think you asked for, which is on the law of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
The text reads, and by the way, I've practiced in the federal courts. That's
Okay.
my job. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law. That was extended by the 14th Amendment in various cases to apply to state governments as well.
Right.
But the Bill of Rights, First Amendment included, only restricts state actors. So private institutions, state universities are a whole different animal, but private institutions aren't bounded by the First Amendment. So they can, for example, through a anti-harassment policy, et cetera, restrict what otherwise would be permissible speech under the First Amendment.
So Harvard could if they wanted to.
Yes.
So maybe that explains what Columbia's been trying to do, although so far it seems to be backfiring, which is they suspended certain pro-Palestinian groups from campus. All that's happening is the groups are still holding activities that are now sponsored by other groups. Or you have faculty members acting as, what's the word, not shill, fronts or something.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. So do you have an answer then? Do you think that a private university could effectively ban certain kinds of speech? I understand anti-harassment, but like a sign that says Free Gaza or a sign that says, you know, Intifada or something.
Well, I mean, could a university, I think the word you used, which is that makes the answer to the question difficult.
Yeah,
is could they effectively,
right.
right? Could a university, a non-state university do that?
Right.
Yes. I think we're just my personal opinion, then I actually want to get to my question.
Right.
Could a university prohibit someone from saying, I want you dead?
Right.
I am a proponent of genocide. Yes, a university can do that, even though that's permissible speech.
Right. Right.
That I think could fairly be blocked. Where to draw the line is a matter of ongoing, very heated public debate, but I'm not giving a lecture today.
Okay.
The question,
Oh,
however,
thank you, by the way. That's great. Thank you. You're not going to bill me, are you?
Maybe not.
7 minutes,
The
right?
question, though, is to
Second.
respectfully challenge a little bit of what you said
Yeah.
in the seventh tier by saying, well, the song, the Shevet Achim V'Achayot, is only sung by Jews. And how does this fairly represent Israel? I would question, is that the intent of the song to represent Israel? Is it
Right.
Shevet Achim V'Achayot, brothers and sisters?
Right.
And we all met at Sinai, we're all brothers and sisters. So was the intent of the song to really represent the whole of the modern state of Israel
Right.
versus what
Yeah.
we would more commonly refer to as, like Klal Yisrael?
No, that's a very fair question. And it might very well have been. In fact, I very much doubt that they were thinking, oh, we're going to leave out the non-Jews. But that in a way makes it more interesting for me. That I'll just give you an example. The Jerusalem program of the World Zionist Organization from 2000 or whatever it is, it has all this stuff about the state of Israel. There's not one mention of non-Jews in the entire program. And the American Zionist movement, the AZM, also has a statement from 2004 of sort of what the state of Israel is. Non-Jews just don't appear once. So I think this is a systemic challenge that we need to think through because, it's funny, there's a whole process of Israelicization among Israel's Arab citizens. Whatever their identities are, which are extremely complicated, and some identify as Palestinians and want to be called Palestinians, some want to be called Arabs. It's sort of a little bit like pronouns now. When you meet someone, it's like, what's your name? What are your pronouns? So now if I meet an Arab citizen of the state of Israel, one of my first questions is, what do you want to be called? Because they vary. But there's so much that the state of Israel could do to really think through what it means to have a state with a Jewish character, but in which there is a substantial and growing non-Jewish minority. So that's where I see the song as just a symptom of this problem. But like I said, it's a really beautiful song. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, for your words. We are a proudly Zionist organization, but one that is not afraid to be critical of Israel when we need to be, and one that loves to celebrate. I think one kind of Zionism that resonates with me is joyful Zionism, which that song absolutely captures beautifully. We're going to invite us to transition to our evening service, and as we have done now for every single day at every service, morning and evening, we've acknowledged the difficulty that Israel, and especially our Achim and Achayot, our brothers and sisters, are experiencing in Israel. Many of us in our own community are feeling that. I can tell you as a father of 2 kids on college campuses, they are experiencing challenges of anti-Semitism. I think that many of us have family who are in Israel who are dealing with just an ongoing trauma. And so we come together in as many ways, as many places as we can to support each other. And we do that through prayer, through song, through learning. We'll build on that part of Zionism. I don't know exactly which one. It's maybe a combination of 2, 7, and 4. But we're going to do that, page 264.
We're going to use the smaller red book, the Shabbat book,